Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our first after school hours webinar of this training season. Tonight's topic is on addressing the needs of all students using a multi-tiered system of support. Just to kind of warn you ahead of time, this is the short version. We do a day-long training on this, so it's going to be very, very compact to try and get as much as we can into this 90 minutes. Just some housekeeping to start with. Your cameras have been disabled. This is in webinar mode, and your microphones as well, so you don't have to worry about accidentally showing up on screen or having people hear your side conversations, which is always kind of good. I would ask that if you want to use the chat for any comments, any questions, I would appreciate that rather than the Q&A, just because I'll keep my chat box open and be able to see all of that, and seeing both of them is a little more difficult. My name is Angie McKinney. I'm one of the technical assistant specialists at the IEP TA Center. And for anyone who is kind of new to the change here, we were formerly the Indiana IEP Resource Center. So we just have a new name, but we have a very similar mission and are still here to provide for learning needs and technical assistance and things like facilitated IEPs. So again, welcome, and I'm going to jump right into the content, but please jump in with any questions along the way in the chat. All right, so here's what I am really hoping to get accomplished. You've gotten kind of the overview of things. Within a multi-tiered system of support, we're going to talk about the different components, domains, some of the features and the principles behind the concept of the framework. And that'll be the majority of our time. And then we will dig into a little bit about some of the things that we have to consider related to the infrastructure and implementing the framework within your school or your district. So I'm hoping that you'll walk away understanding those things, both about the background and the pieces and parts, but also around some things that you can do to really help make things more successful as you start to implement this. I'm hoping that some of you already have at least some version of MTSS up and running in your different buildings, and you're just looking to make it a little bit stronger. But either way, we're going to go over the basics. So here is a link to the Padlet that we use for full day training. So you will see that a longer version of the PowerPoint has been uploaded. It's got more slides than what you'll be viewing tonight, but they are very similar. We just don't have time to get into all of the details, but there are so many different things on this Padlet that you can print out, you can learn more. There are just a wealth of different resources on here. And I'm going to put this in the chat so that you can copy this if you need to, in case this flashes by too quickly. But it's an ever-changing resource. So when you get to the Padlet, you may find that as something becomes irrelevant, or as something new comes along, that we change things on the Padlet, and we're always trying to update those materials. So here are some misconceptions that may be out there. There tended to be a lot of pushback when Indiana really first started talking about MTSS. You know, you heard a lot of things that were just not quite right. And these are just different versions of those things. You may not have heard all of these, but sometimes you hear that, well, you know, that's really just about behavior, or that's just about academics. And that is definitely not true. One of the things that kind of makes MTSS what it is and makes it a more comprehensive framework is that it is not just about covering academics, but behavior and mental wellness and the intertwining nature of all of those things, because we know that none of those things happen in isolation. Kids with behavior problems tend to get behind. Kids who are behind too long sometimes end up with some issues around behavior or their ability to cope with the educational environment. There's just so much interconnection. You also sometimes hear that, like many things in education, it's a fad. The pendulum swings, and eventually nobody's going to be talking about this. Really, it has been a long-standing framework that has taken hold not only in Indiana, but in several states. MTSS is part of the expectation, sometimes connected with certain areas of special education, but it is definitely a general education framework for every kid, every adult, everybody that's part of the larger system. I've heard that, well, that's really just about students with disabilities and getting them to special education services. Or I've heard the opposite. MTSS is not for students with disabilities. So once a student is identified, they don't get MTSS. Well, MTSS is not a thing. It's how we look at everything that we do. And we never discriminate against students with disabilities. Anything that is available to support students is available to anyone within our general education framework or system. We also try not to think about students in terms of the tier of services that they might be receiving in a particular area. It's not, this is a tier 2 student, a tier 3 student. We really stick with that person first language. So a student may get a particular support, but only in the areas that they need it. So they are not a tier 3 student for everything. They might be a student who needs some tier 3 support for social skills, or tier 2 support for math fluency or something like that. So MTSS is just one more thing. Well, it's one more thing to learn, but it is definitely not another initiative or thing or process. It is the overarching framework that helps us tie together everything that we do within our system and helps us look at things in a way that allocates the resources and the time and the effort where it needs to go, and really individualizing things for students. Really doesn't cost extra money or extra time. It is building on what we already have within our system. It is part, at least currently, of Indiana's Every Student Succeeds Act plan. And you can see that in a number of ways. You can see it in the graphic that they use to describe what really good learning looks like for students. So you can see in the graphic on the right-hand side that we know that working together, collaborating, the instructional piece, the curriculum piece, the assessment piece, all of those are core to what we do for all students. But if you look around the outside edge, it's kind of encircled by everything happening using a lens of universal design for learning and through a multi-tiered system of support framework. So those things are part of the expectation, even though it's not, in a particular law in Indiana, it is still part of the expectation that we are meeting the needs of students in every way that we possibly can. Indiana also has some of their guiding principles around MTSS. And we know that all of these things are really important, but I want to point out 2 of them very specifically that helps to differentiate MTSS from other frameworks like response to intervention and PBIS, which are both very, very good. And I think a lot of people think, well, MTSS is really just RTI with a new name. There's a little bit of truth to that. Not completely. There is some truth to that, but really what it is a broader framework than either of those. So within multi-tiered system of support, it really does include everyone. Everything we do at every moment of the day still falls within that overarching framework of a multi-tiered system of support. We plan for everyone. We sometimes do things a little different for some people, and we do things very different for a few people. And that's just the nature of life. And so when we look at everything that happens within the schools and make sure that we are including all kids in this and every possible staff member, it really does become just a way of operating. There is no stepping into or out of MTSS. We're always under that umbrella. The other point that kind of helps make things a little bit different from other frameworks is the emphasis on the whole child. So not separating out behavior and academics and mental wellness, but truly looking at those through the lens of I'm a person that has many, many different sides, and all of those things are interconnected. So it kind of starts with having some core beliefs. And in order for MTSS, for the framework to really be effective, we have to think about, as a community, as a staff, how do we, what do we believe in? And if we believe these four things, and everyone's going to really fall on a continuum of how much do they believe these things? Are there some yeah buts in there? But to start with, we really need to think that there has to be a belief that all kids can learn and achieve to high standards. Now, those standards may be slightly different for each kid, but we always have to be thinking that we need to set the bar high. Everybody's got the potential to keep moving forward and to rise up to whatever level we put in front of them. The second one is an understanding that learning and also our teaching has to include both the academic and social competencies. No longer is it that kids come to us knowing already how to be students, knowing how to sit in a chair, knowing how to remain quiet when adults are talking, those things. But when I went to kindergarten, we were just expected to come ready for those things. We know that so much of behavior has to be deliberately taught to some of our kiddos. So we have to make sure that all of our colleagues understand that it just doesn't happen. Kids don't show up at middle school with all of them knowing how to complete an agenda. Even though we'd really like for that to happen, some of our kids have to have direct instruction in that. The third one is that everybody within the educational community is on a continuous learning path. So we're continuing to change as we learn more in the field, as our kids change, as society changes, and we have to constantly be moving in a different direction. I love that Indiana is on board with the science of reading. And I think, as we know more and more about what the research is telling us, we shift in a different direction. So I think that's a really good change for us. And then the last one is just that every leader and every educator at every level is responsible for every kid. It really has to be that community thinking of, well, maybe I don't have this student right now, but I might get them, right? And in order for me to be successful as an educator, then I have to help all of you be successful as well. So we're always pulling each other upward. And the more that we can say we are absolutely on board with these beliefs, the more that the MTSS framework is useful and is effective in in determining what we do next, and how we support students. So I want you to think just for a minute. I know we don't have that many people on here today, but I do want you to do a quick poll for me. And I'm going to show you these first. So I want you to think about, either if you're in an individual building or if you work at the district level, think about your building. So these are not your personal beliefs, but within your colleagues, where do you think your building or district is right now with the 4 different beliefs? So 5 would be, we are on board, we are all in, we're gung-ho, ready to go. 4, most of us are on board or really believe these things. 3 may be that, well, we believe this, but sometimes our actions aren't showing that. 2 is staff are split. Some believe it, some don't. And then 1 would be, okay, yeah, we're ready for, for doing some good work on this. So I'm going to launch this poll really quickly. I see some of you are putting it in the chat, but just go ahead and type either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Give you just another minute. I know a couple of you are on your phone, and that makes it a little bit harder sometimes to get to the polls. So all right, I'm going to go ahead and end it. All right, so this is what we see. At least I'm hoping that you're seeing this, that the majority of people are seeing at about a 3, that, yeah, we're kind of there, but sometimes what we do isn't showing that we have those beliefs. So that is, I mean, it's good in the sense that we've got some general beliefs there, but sometimes it's those yeah buts that get in the way. Yeah, but maybe not for these kids. Yeah, but you know, I've been teaching for 30 years. What else is there to learn? You know, there are lots of yeah buts. All right, so the thinking within the MTSS framework really moves us away from the thinking of what's wrong with this kid? What is happening within this kid that might be something we could fix, right? Or maybe it's a disability, or maybe it's a temperament, or, you know, whatever it is. We used to always try to get to the root of what's going on with this kid. And it really shifts us to thinking more about what is it within the things that we control, either within the environment, or within the way that we teach, or the way that we set things up, that are not leading to learning for this kid, whether it's academic behavior or mental wellness kind of learning. So it's just a little shift in thinking, which I like. All right, the whole child approach. I said that is one of the ways that we see things a little bit differently within the MTSS framework. I used to do a lot of work with schools that I worked in that were heavily invested in response to intervention. And my background is in school psychology. And so I absolutely loved working with those teams, and I love data. And we had a lot of students or a lot of schools that would set up data walls. Nothing wrong with data walls. In fact, you know, they kind of make me a little bit excited to see all that data up there. But we would do things like we would take those little tiny green, yellow, and pink Post-it notes, and we would put the kids' data on there, and then we would basically arrange it into the triangle, right? And this was great, but it only worked one subject at a time, because I may have been on a pink Post-it for the first area that we were looking at. And even within an area, let's say within reading, Maybe I was great at decoding and my little Post-it would be a green. But when it came to reading comprehension, I was a pink, right? So it can be very, very different for each kid. And if we really think about not where do we stick a kid within the overarching triangle, right, that usually represents our models, but what does my triangle look like? So this is a little bit different. This is thinking about what do I have to offer as a student? What things do I have that I don't need any other instruction or support that's similar to my peers? But what things do I maybe need a little bit of extra support? And what do I need a lot of support in? So every student really represents their own triangle as far as their strengths and their challenge areas. Or sometimes it's not a challenge area, it's an area where we need extension. Some of our high ability learners may not be thriving within the regular instruction because they need something different. So this is an opportunity to also plan for some extension for students. Wrong direction. So you have on the Padlet, you have a handout that looks similar to this too, that represents the different domains that are part of multi-tiered system of support. And you'll notice that the fifth one is multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. Now, when I was first learning response to intervention, when it was kind of a new thing a million years ago, that is really all we focused on was the triangle. You know, what is tier 2? What is tier 1? All of those pieces. And those pieces are incredibly important. But for a lot of places where using a framework really didn't take hold, it's because we didn't pay enough attention to the other important domains that are related to multi-tiered system of support. So you see leadership, capacity building infrastructure, communication and collaboration, the problem-solving process itself, and data evaluation. Again, all of those things are really important. And we're going to touch on each of those to a lesser extent today. But we're going to start with the triangle, start with what we know. And I'll try to point out where the thinking is maybe a little bit different than what you might know from response to intervention as we go through this. So we're going to start with the most important piece. If you get nothing else from today, I want you to walk away saying tier 1 is the most important tier. Absolutely. It is our first best instruction. And not every tier 1 is the same. If I go to an elementary school in one district, the tier 1 supports may look different than the tier 1 supports in an elementary that's down the road or 2 counties over or on the other end of the state, because they have different kids, they have different needs, they have different resources. And every now and then your tier changes. We review our textbook series and say, you know what, this isn't working for us. We need something different. We review different programs that we use school-wide and make some changes over time. We sometimes change our motto. We sometimes change like the number of minutes that are allotted for recess. All of those are selected very purposefully to make sure that it's matching up with what our students need. Now, the first piece is that everything needs to be evidence-based. So we're not just picking the shiny box with the best salesman. We are truly looking at what's got some research behind it that says, if you do this, your kids will be expected to make these amount of gains, right? So we're always looking for the good stuff to put things in place. We'll know if our tier 1 is a good match and is effective if at least 80% of our kids are meeting what we set as benchmarks for them. If not, we need to work here because this affects everyone. So we need to make sure that we shore up the foundation before we start building additional things on top of that. So we start by just having some goals for our system. And part of that is determining what do we expect all kids to know. Some of this can be done even at grade level discussions or meetings to say, okay, in kindergarten, when we get to this point in the year, whether it's beginning, middle, or end of the year, what do we expect kids at that level to learn? Whether it's academically, behaviorally, or related to mental wellness. And then how are we going to know? Like, how do I know that they've learned it? What evidence am I going to look at to tell me whether or not it's there? Some of us have some benchmark assessments that that we give. Other times it's material that's collected in the classroom. And then how are we going to respond? What are we going to do if they're not there? What's the plan? Or what are we going to do if they've already mastered the content? If kids come to us and they already know, you get a kindergartner that's already reading, well, you can't say, okay, well, you just hang tight for a year and then, eventually everybody else is going to catch up to you. We look at how are we going to take that student forward and how are we going to grow them to reach their potential. In order to really know this, again, we've got to have some assessment data. And generally at Tier 1, we're looking at universal screening or benchmarking 3 times a year in each of the areas that we are looking at. So we've got to have some stuff related to the academics. And most elementaries already have this, whether it's through NWEA or whether it's through DIBELS, and some math assessments, or everybody's got their own programs that they're using. But we have to have this data in order to assess how we're doing. Otherwise, we just won't know. We can't wait until the end of the year and say, that didn't go very well. Let's think again. I'm just going to respond to the question really quickly too. You guys will actually get an evaluation form. You'll get a link to that as we end, and everyone who attends tonight will get a certificate emailed to them within the next few days. All right, evidence-based core instruction is absolutely important, and it has to be implemented with fidelity. So this is something that's really important that we don't know. I'll just give you a kind of a related example. My daughter had an eye infection recently, and she got prescription eye drops. And after a while, I'm like, okay, your eye looks better. And then it started to look kind of bad again. And she's like, I don't think the drops are working. I'm like, well, are you using them like you're supposed to? Like, are you following the directions and putting them in at the time you're supposed to, the way you're supposed to? Are you making sure to wash your hands first? All that kind of stuff. Well, sometimes not. It's the same thing with our instruction. We have to make sure that whatever it is we're doing it the way it's intended to be done. We're doing it with the frequency, with the procedures, all of that kind of stuff that needs to happen in order to be able to say whether or not it's effective. We can't necessarily say that something wasn't effective if we weren't doing it correctly. All right, so I just want you to think about for a second. You don't have to put this in the chat, but if you're thinking about your own Tier 1 within your building, what kind of things are in place? Are you able to describe what is the core instruction for academics? What is the core instruction and the core programming that we use for behavior? What about mental wellness? Are we teaching those things? And then what screeners are being used? Typically, what we find is that schools do a really good job with screening, doing universal screening or benchmarking for reading. Pretty close with math, not so much with writing. Not a whole lot related to mental wellness. That usually is one of the areas that people find that, gosh, we just don't have this. And so for behavior. And one of the things that you might want to think about is that not everything has to be a test or has to be something that is purchased. So when you're talking about behavior or you're talking about mental wellness, a lot of data can be mined from your attendance data, office referrals. Nurse visits is a gold mine when it comes to really looking at some students who may need some additional support. If it's health related, that's fine. When it's not, that it's usually something related to behavior or mental wellness. Counselor visits, classroom behavior data, class dojo, any sort of point system that a teacher may have. There's a lot of information that can be mined from existing data sources without having to create something new. But there are some different screeners and assessments out there. You can find some things on the Padlet. And I'll put that back up at the end of this session too, just in case anybody missed it. Now, here's the thing. What if your triangle doesn't look so good? What if when you look at how kids are doing, we're not anywhere close to that 80% and your triangle's upside down? Few kids that you can say, yep, absolutely, what we do is all they need. And you have so many kids needing intervention and support. This can be rough. This can be really draining within your school. So a drain on resources, just a drain on I think teacher well-being in a lot of cases of, oh my gosh, how do I get the kids where they need to be in these different areas? So it could be that the core instruction, the tier 1 that we have planned, is just not a good match, or it could be fidelity issues. For some of us, I know we're seeing still pockets of kids that are needing extra support because of learning loss. So, that could be the reasoning for it. Or it could be that if you really look back across 5-10 years, it's always been flipped. And that happens sometimes too. So what happens, right? Well, start with tier 1. Again, I'll say it again and again. Tier 1 is the most important tier. This is where, if it is not solid, this is where your effort should be within the school. So strengthen that tier 1. See if you need additional data. Sometimes the data sources that we have aren't really telling us what we want to know. Look for any patterns. Are there pockets of kids? Is it whether it's certain grade levels, certain classrooms, boys versus girls, whether it's you can see racial patterns of, we have certain groups of kids that are struggling more in particular areas. The more that you can really dig into your data, the more that you can consider whether other things may be playing into this as well. Another thing that you can consider that we won't be able to get into very much, but I believe there is a webinar that you can look at on the Padlet, is class-wide intervention, or tier 1.5 is another way that people can describe this. So it's basically providing an intervention, but it's saying everybody needs it in this class. So we're going to do something for everybody and just build it into that core instruction. So when we look at tier 1, again, we want to look at our benchmarks. Think, are we anywhere close to that 80%? I mean, it's a marker for us, but Are we close to that? Is what we're doing in tier one even evidence-based? Are we doing it with fidelity? And then do we pitch it, right? Do we start over, or is it salvageable? Or is it something that we can supplement with something else in order to make sure that it works? Is it delivered with appropriate dosage? So we know there are programs out there that might say this is a 90-minute, 4-day-a-week program, but we really can only fit it in 60 minutes, but we can maybe do 5 days a week and make up for that. It may or may not produce the same results in that way. So we have to really think about, are we getting exactly what we need? Now, we know that there are certain guidelines out there. So for example, Indiana requires at the elementary school level that you have 90 minutes of uninterrupted instruction in reading. So that's a given, right? And it's based on something. It's based on the fact that we know that most kids are going to need that. But in your school, is 90 minutes enough? Maybe, maybe not. There are some times when we may say, gosh, you know what? If I had 120 minutes every day to work on this, I think they would get it. I think that would be the right dosage. And if that's what it takes, then that is what your tier one should be, as opposed to 90 minutes that leaves 50% of kids struggling. And now I've got 50% of my class that I've got to plug into additional supports and groups. It may make more sense in some ways just to increase the effort for everyone. So when you use a class-wide intervention, I just want to show you, again, we can't get into details on it, but it does allow you to reach more kids. And there's very little impact other than it's a little bit of time here and there, but it reduces the number of your kids who are going to need those extra tier 2 and tier 3 supports. And it grows all kids. Even the kids who didn't need it are going to continue to grow. So as you look at some of the different practices that are out there, again, we know we want to have evidence-based things, but we want to have things that also produce a lot of impact. So if any of you are familiar with John Hattie's work, which is around just compiling many, many, many different studies, not doing them, but compiling them to look across different studies and doing meta-analyses, he's able to look at then what kind of effects the ES that you'll see, or the D, there are different ways of describing this, is the effect size or how much impact that something has. And so when you get something that has a low number, if you have something that produces 0 or has even a negative number, some of those things actually decrease achievement over time. They have a negative effect on students. We have some things that between 0 and 0.15 effect size that even if we didn't teach it, they just kind of get it, right? So if something that has the effect of that is like we didn't even work on it. Something that is a little bit higher, between 0.15 and 0.4, it's about what we typically can accomplish in a year with teaching. We want things to have a stronger impact. So the more, the higher the effect size, the more of an impact that we have. So if we have something that's 0.4, that would be about a year's worth of growth. Something that would be 0.8 could produce even, maybe 2 years worth of growth, just depending on the type of intervention. So I want you to look at a couple of things here. And some of these things are things that you can do as part of a class-wide intervention. These are really strong practices to have. Classroom discussions, the good behavior game, planning and prediction. Those are all activities that can take place within class-wide intervention practices. And then look at the effect size just for response to intervention. So this is similar to having an MTSS framework. 1.29 to have those deliberate processes set up for monitoring students' data and for matching them up with appropriate interventions. Good effect sizes. But even if our tier 1 is solid, the expectation is that not one size does not fit all, right? So even if we have really good, solid tier 1 instruction in those different areas, we're going to have some areas that kind of bubble up to the surface to say, we've got pockets of students that need support around these different areas. And those are going to change over time as well. Those students need supplemental targeted instruction. And those words are really important. Supplemental meaning I don't leave tier 1 instruction to go get this. I get this on top of the core instruction. I need more. I don't just need different. Targeted means that we're spending our time really focused in on particular areas so that we're not giving kids packages of skills that may be practicing things that they didn't need. I'll tell you what I mean by that. I know that's kind of hard to explain, but I may know that a student is struggling in reading, but again, not all kids who struggle in reading struggle the same way. Some may struggle with phonemic awareness. Some may struggle with decoding skills. Others may have difficulty with reading fluency. And a lot of our kind of package, here's a supplemental program, gets you a little bit of everything, right? A little decoding, a little fluency, a little comprehension, a little vocabulary, which is part of how we teach in general. That tends to be part of the core, is that we're hitting it from all angles as we teach students. But if my need is specific, then the intervention should be specific as well. And here's why. If I'm a student who struggles with reading fluency, then I need practice with reading aloud, with getting feedback from, hearing models, all of that kind of stuff related to my fluency. If I'm in an intervention that's happening, let's even say a small group, 30 minutes, 3 times a week. That sounds like I'm getting 90 minutes of supplemental instruction a week. And that sounds great. But if my need is fluency, and really within that 30 minutes, I only get 2 minutes to read out loud as part of my reading and get feedback, suddenly my 90 minutes of reading intervention is only about 6 minutes a week of reading fluency intervention. And if you think, is somebody going to make sufficient growth with 6 minutes of reading fluency instruction? I mean, the obvious answer is no, it's not going to be enough. But if we spent that whole time working on reading fluency, imagine the kind of growth that a student can make. So we have to know enough about what's going on with the student to say, yes, this is a fluency issue. Yes, this is a decoding issue, and plug kids into the right support so that we're making good use of that time. So time is hard to come by. That's one of the most difficult things, I think, in education is we don't get any more time in the day. So we have to figure out what we're going to do with the time that we have. All right, so supplemental and targeted, those are keys here. And we'll know that our tier 2 is effective if approximately 70 to 80% of the students who are getting tier 2 support are making progress. So in order to figure out what they need, like what does this look like? How many minutes is tier 2? It depends, right? And it depends on the answers to these questions. So where's the student starting from? Where's the group of students that you're worried about in this area starting from? Where do we want them to be? And look at the difference between where I am and where we want where we want the student to be. How much time do we have to get them there? And how much growth am I going to have to make? Like how much do we have to kick it in gear in order to actually start closing that gap and heading towards our goal? And then what resources will move them at that rate? So if you're thinking about this is around determining the dosage of the intervention. How much is it going to take? Because if I'm on a certain path, but for some of our kids, the path that you're on, the growth rate that you've had is only going to get you further away from the rest of the class over time unless we change something. So how much is not only going to stop me from getting further behind, but also start to close that gap? How much do we need to do? How critical is the skill? And that's an important piece too. When you're determining those tier 2 supports, we have to think about evidence-based practices, right? So we're using good stuff, but you also want to think about problem solving for those common areas that you see. And I would suggest that at tier 2 that you use your resources to do problem solving at the problem level, not the student level. Meaning maybe our fourth grade teachers get together and say, I'm really seeing a lot of students who struggle with this concept in math, or with just math fluency in general, or with disagreeing with friends appropriately. Sometimes you bring things up in those meetings and somebody else says, oh, I got one just like that, right? So rather than let's meet on Johnny, let's meet on Sally, let's meet on Susie, we say, well, as a team, let's problem solve. What could we do to support that particular area? And once you have that happen, then you can start plugging kids in and out of the resource as opposed to designing a new resource every time. Now, this is for those mild needs of students who just need a little extra support. So you think about some of the common issues that come up. And again, those are going to be different issues at different grade levels, different school systems, different buildings. You want to have a good, solid toolbox of potential things that can support those areas without it being so big and having so many things available that you don't really know how to do any of them well. If we have a couple of key things that could support each of those areas and we get really good at them, they're going to have more impact with students. We're going to build our capacity to do more and more when we keep it smaller. So although I mean, some of those intervention manuals that are out there are good for starting your thinking, but what you don't want is to have teachers pull out one of those manuals and flip through and try to find something every time to support kids. The support should already be there, kind of waiting to put the kids in and out of them. And kids do go in and out of supports. You get the support for as long as you need it. And when you don't need it, we need to get back to just tier 1. The only way that we're going to do that is by having good assessment data. And so assessment is a little bit different at the tier 2 and tier 3 level, because it needs to be specific assessment data that is aligned with the area of concern. So while you may have benchmarking data that says, okay, your score in reading is this, and it's kind of a general, problem or not problem in reading. When you're talking about progress monitoring, you want to get down to the level of decoding, fluency, comprehension, whatever it is that is being supported, that is the area that needs to be monitored. And it needs to be monitored more often so that we're making good decisions about when to change what's going on with a student, when to pull them into more support, when to reduce the amount of support and plug somebody else into it. So the general suggestion is to progress monitor at least one time a month, and it may be more often depending on the setup of your support structure. And then we have to make sure that the instruction is happening with fidelity. I can't benefit from an intervention that I'm not there for. So, when we have a student who's absent, almost every Wednesday and Thursday, then I'm getting a whole lot less of something. So again, we can't necessarily say that, boy, you're just not growing with that intervention. If I'm not getting it, I can't grow from it. So again, I want you to just kind of think on your own about what's in place in your buildings. What kind of evidence-based programs are used? There are some that are out there that are used pretty consistently that don't really have a lot of good evidence behind them to say that they're effective. So sometimes it's a matter of taking stock in what do we have going in our building and is it working? Because if it's not, it may be time for a change. Or we may have so many different programs going on that it's just cluttering our system. And then thinking about our progress monitoring. Do we have the tools that we need to be able to know whether a student is truly benefiting from the supports that they're receiving? All right, Tier 3 is very similar. The biggest difference with Tier 3 is it is more intensive, it is more individualized, and we're problem solving on the individual student level. So this is the time where we do need a meeting on the student. Again, if we tried to have a meeting on every student at the Tier 2 level, you're going to do nothing but meetings, and nobody wants that. But for our few kids who need super intensive instruction, it is important that we're looking at all aspects of what's going on with the student. We're asking basically the same questions. And we may have asked these questions back at Tier 2 and determined that, you know what, this kid needs to have super intensive things right away. There's no pathway really through this framework. There's no that we have to start with Tier 1 and then add on Tier 2 and then move to Tier 3. If you get a kid that moves in tomorrow and suddenly they have an intense Tier 3 need, that's okay. It's okay to move to that. And it's almost arbitrary whether we call it Tier 2 or Tier 3, because it just has to be what the student needs. And the more that you know about the student, the more that you're able to provide that. But it continues to kind of layer on the other instructions. So if I have Tier 1 and it wasn't enough, and so we added on Tier 2, and that's just not quite enough either. So we're going to add on more. We're not going to take away what is already in place, but we're going to add some additional supports on. When I say individual instruction, I do want to kind of clarify that that doesn't always mean one-on-one. And in fact, the research shows that one-on-one is sometimes not as good as one-on-two, one-on-three, one-on-four. It just means that we're intensifying in some way. So smaller group, more focused as far as skill or particular area. It may be that we intensify by increasing the expertise of the person who's providing the intervention. So suddenly, I'm getting my Tier 1 instruction in reading from a teacher. I'm getting some supplemental instruction from another teacher, or maybe even from my classroom teacher or from Title I. And then maybe at Tier 3, I'm working with a reading specialist in the district to really work on those skills. We want to make sure that we ramp up the assessment as well. We're spending a lot of district resources when we have Tier 3 supports. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them, but it means that we need to really assess how we're distributing these resources to students. So we have to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on with the student. We typically would progress monitor in the area of concern once a week in order to have lots and lots of data. They say that, 4 to 6 data points is truly a bare minimum of what it takes for even determining a trend line to know whether we're on an up, down, or straight across kind of pathway with a student. And that, again, is a very bare minimum. So in order to get enough points to reasonably look at how is the student doing, we've got to take data a lot more often. And again, those other bullet points are the same thing that is important at tier 1 and tier 2, that things need to be evidence-based and they need to be implemented with fidelity. So again, take stock in what's going on. How are you progress monitoring? What kind of programs are you using? And I want to show you an example of this. Was from a district level. A district had completed kind of what they thought they had going on across their buildings in academic, behavioral, and mental wellness supports at tier 1, 2, and 3. Now, these do cut across. Not every building had everything, so it looks a little different if they would do it at the individual building level. But for this district, they could clearly see that they've got a lot of things covering their academics, but not so much when it came to especially mental wellness. Those are things that they had a few things in place, but they may have more needs cropping up that aren't being supported. But it's a good idea to sit down within your district and kind of map out, what do you have? Because sometimes we have things, or we have resources in our district that we didn't know. Like maybe we have somebody who's Orton Gillingham trained at their old school, and then they came here, and we don't do that. So the knowledge is just kind of sitting there. Or maybe we have a program that somebody bought during one of the years where we had stimulus money that had to be spent, and the box has never been opened. We sometimes have things like that are sitting on shelves because we've never gotten the training to implement those things. Or again, you may look at these and say, you know what, I just don't know that this is giving us the outcome we're looking for. So I want to talk just for a second, just one slide on what about everything else that we do? Where does that fit within MTSS? And the answer is the same for everything at all levels. So no matter which thing that you took from this slide and inserted into that center white part of the triangle, everything happens at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. We need to make sure that we're using culturally responsive practices with our tier 1 instruction, our tier 2, and our tier 3. If we have a student who receives special education and has specially designed instruction, we do that as part of their tier 1. But if they need tier 2 supports or tier 3 supports, we have to see if they need specially designed instruction at those levels as well. So everything that you can pretty much think of will fit within all levels of MTSS. They're not outside of the triangle. They are not separate entities. They are integrated into what we do. All right, so we're going to do just a quick jump into each of the other domains. So we're going to start with leadership. In order to really have this framework take hold, it's got to start from the top. We've got to have principal leadership in order to have things spread. There's some other things in schools where sometimes you can get kind of that grassroots effort, but there's so much that the principal has to be on board with in order to make this successful that it is truly critical. There should be a school-based leadership team that's helping to facilitate the implementation of MTSS. That does not mean this is a team that does all the problem solving or does all of the interventions. It means it's a team of people saying, what's this going to look like in our building? Who needs various kinds of supports as far as our staff? How are we going to put this all together? How does this connect with our school improvement plan? Because it should connect very directly. So all of that is important as far as the leadership is concerned in making sure that we've got a solid approach to setting the climate for this to even take hold. Capacity building infrastructure. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about with making sure that you're growing your ability to do these different things, that if we have interventions that we know what we're doing and how to do them, and that we have assessment tools that we know how to use. We have to build that capacity, and having the infrastructure for that is really important. So some of this comes from making sure that we start to use common language, that we all understand what those terms mean. We get some training out there, some basic training for the rest of your staff. That the leadership team is facilitating the PD needs, the professional development needs, and any coaching needs for staff members on how to do different things, how to, again, put the interventions in place. How does it fit into my role? How to look at the assessment data, how to do the assessment data right? How to give the assessments appropriately, because sometimes that doesn't happen. It's also important to make sure that we got a little flexibility to be able to manipulate the schedule. And I don't mean that you're going back and trying to change your schedule tomorrow, but I mean that we have to look for those opportunities within the schedules to make sure that we do have time to get people trained, that we have time for people to work together and to problem solve on issues and on students, that there's time that the interventions can actually take place. Sometimes that's difficult. There's some really good books, I'm looking on my shelf now, called It's About Time. And there is one that is, these are on the Padlet as well. There's one that's elementary based and one that is secondary based. But it is about that issue of how do we find the time to do the stuff that we think will improve outcomes for students. But it's a really good read. We need to have all of the processes. I need to know, if I'm a classroom teacher, how do I get started with this? What kind of data do I collect? Are there forms to fill out? Are there procedures to follow? When do I ask for a meeting? When do I tell other people that I have a concern? What are the different decision rules for when a student might move in or out of a particular support? These are all things that I would really want to know. And I think when we don't have those clear procedures and processes, we get some kids who get supported and some kids who don't, based on what their teacher knows about the process. And quite honestly, that's just not fair. It's not equitable. So we need to make sure that we shore these things up as part of building that infrastructure to increase the capacity. And then we're also making sure that we figure out, what do we have? What are our resources? And how are we going to divvy those up in order to make sure that everybody gets what they need? All right, communication and collaboration. Whoops. So we've got to have a consensus about what does MTSS even look like. And again, we do that somewhat from professional learning opportunities and putting things in writing, so that somebody has like a manual or something to go by. And that the expectation comes from the top to say, this is the framework we're using. It has to be an expectation. So we have to engage in MTSS. And it's really important that we take stock in how are we doing with our MTSS. It's not an overnight process. And you're going to have areas that you're looking to improve upon and areas that you think you're doing really well with. There are tools out there that help you assess the implementation fidelity of MTSS for our system. So it's looking at, how are our team meetings going? How is our communication? How do we have assessments cutting across all areas? It helps us take stock in how we're doing and where we want to improve on. But it's important that our staff know how we're doing, because usually it's a leadership team that is completing those kinds of assessments about how we're doing. And if we don't share it out with the staff to say, look, you're making great progress in this area, keep it up, they won't know what to do next. They also have to have good student data information sent their way as well. So yeah, it's great if I have data on my kids in my class, but I also would want to know, where are the other fourth graders? Where's our building? How is our district doing? What did the outcomes look like? And those things are available, but they're not always easily available and accessible to classroom teachers and to other staff. We also have to think about how we engage with families and other stakeholders out in the community. And do we have the infrastructure to build in some of that, to help share information out about data and about our intervention processes and supports to parents, to community members, to anyone who's involved. And we want to make sure that we include families in that process when we're problem solving, so that they understand what it is, that it's not a thing, it's not hoops to jump through. This is how we do education within our building. Just a little bit about the problem solving process. Now, problem solving is something that we do pretty naturally. And there are a lot of different problem solving models out there, and most of them have kind of some similar features of, we've got to look at, what is the problem, and is that what the data is telling us? So usually problem identification, problem analysis, developing a plan and implementing a plan, and evaluation of the process. Those are usually basic steps. If you have a problem-solving process in place for your meetings or maybe within your PLCs, it's okay to use that. That's great. The key is that we're making sure to use a problem-solving process, and that we're not going into problem-solving sessions and then just using gut instinct. We're actually using data to guide us through this. So we want to have problem solving that is based on data, and that it occurs across all different levels, different content areas, grade levels, and then it's happening at all tiers. So even within tier 1, we're using a problem solving process to say, let's look at the data, let's find out our kids where we expected. Are they above? Are they below? That's important at every level. We're also using the data to figure out, what is that gap? How big is it? It's not always just that how many kids didn't hit the benchmark. Are they way below? Are they a little below? That tells us more about what we need to do. We're also using data to figure out the why. Why are students not meeting expectations? Was it COVID? Was it my instruction maybe isn't where it needs to be? Was it that things just aren't matching up? What is going on? And then we're using that to develop plans and implementing those plans based on those reasons. There are a lot of different reasons why a student might struggle with a particular skill. We're looking at the progress along the way. So when we set goals for students, we're tracking their progress to see how well things are happening. We're tracking the implementation fidelity of the interventions and the instruction. We're looking at those patterns. So again, we want to make sure that we're disaggregating the data so that we look across different ways to find out what are some of the issues that could be out there. Maybe what we're doing isn't working so well with a particular group of students. And then we're also problem solving the implementation of MTSS as a framework as a whole. So when we have an area that is not maybe going so well, maybe our communication and collaboration efforts are not going so well, why? What are the barriers that are keeping us from reaching the level that we want to, and how can we problem solve through that? So we're problem solving everything. And then data evaluation, which there's so much overlap between these different areas too. They really all are interdependent on the other domain areas. But within data, we have to have the right data. And, you know, I probably don't have to tell anybody on here that we assess and we assess and we assess, right? You all are tired of testing, and I totally understand that. We need to think about the data that we do collect. Do we have a good grip on what it's telling us? Is it telling us something we already knew? Because if so, that's kind of pointless data, right? If we get all our classroom assessment or get our benchmarking assessment data back and we're able to look through and say, yeah, I knew all this, then why would we have done it in the first place, right? We also sometimes test the same thing like 4 different ways. That's a lot of wasted time. So we need to think about those data sources that we have. Now, the data that we do have should tell us why, or they should tell us who is at risk, why they're at risk. They should be able to show growth and progress when they do receive some supports. They should help us figure out, now what do we do? What comes next? So helping us with that instruction or intervention planning. And then it should also tell us when a kid gets there, right? When they have reached the outcome that we're looking for. And it's important that, again, everyone has access to that data and they understand it. For those of you who are classroom teachers, again, I know many schools use NWEA data or NWEA data, depending on where you live in the state as to what you call it. I just remember as a psychologist, the first time I was handed like a page full of RIT scores. I'm like, what the heck's a RIT score? And, you know, if somebody says, well, you know, they were a 248 in reading. If you gave me a percentage, a percentile, a standard score, a T-score, I would know what all of those things meant. I had no idea what a 248 RIT score was until I could compare it then to a chart of expectations. And you'll find that you have some of your colleagues know this stuff so well and others who maybe don't know it that well. So it's critical that we know, when I get data, what does it mean? And what is it telling me about the student? Again, we've got to have those policies and procedures and processes in place to help us figure out when do we assess, you know, how do we use this data? And I have to be able to use it effectively. We should be collecting data related to the implementation of MTSS as a whole. And there are tools that schools can use to do that, but that tends to be more at the leadership level. Data helps us to, again, distribute those resources to the right spots so that they're not sitting on a shelf and they're not being given to students who don't need them. And we have to look at those data sources that we have to see, are they helping us, right? Is it telling us what we need? If it doesn't answer the questions, then it is not necessarily going to be helpful. So some considerations that we might want to have, again, looking across those different areas and making sure that you have the data sources that you need in those different areas. Thinking about what are we missing? And sometimes it's not that we're missing it everywhere. It's maybe, typically we've got a lot of good reading assessment that happens until about third grade. And then it kind of just turns into fluency and comprehension only, which is typically okay for most kids. But we need to be able to fall back on when I'm not most kids and I need some additional assessment, what's available to me to get to those underlying skills that most kids already have. And again, you may have just certain grades or certain pockets here and there that are missing a particular kind of data source that you need. You have to make sure that as the instruction intensifies, so as you move up through the tiers, that data is getting collected more and more frequently, and that it becomes more and more targeted to the area of need so that it truly can give us a sense of small changes, right? A lot of times with our benchmarking assessments, we're looking for a big change. If I went from a RIT score of 248 to 249, that's not a big jump, right? Even though I had an increase in score. But if I went from 5 biting incidents to 3 biting incidents, even though we're still biting, that's still a decrease, right? I'm looking for anything that's going to tell me about those little small changes in whatever it is that we're monitoring. Making sure teachers have access to the data. If I have to go to a cumulative file and pull a bunch of sheets, and that's a lot of work, right? If I can pull it up on a computer, if I can look across a dashboard and really get a sense of what's going on, that's good, easy access. Do we understand the data? And do I understand decision rules? Decision rules are really important. Even though everything is looked at as on an individual level, if we have some general decision rules about if you have a student that's below this percentile, we should be adding in a support. That helps to build equitable allocation of resources for students, because what you don't want are 2 nearly identical students in 2 different classrooms and one gets help and one doesn't, because we didn't have clear rules about what to do when and what do these different data pieces mean for students. So it just helps to build more consistency across teachers, across grade levels, across buildings. All right, so now what? And again, you all are getting the super condensed Campbell soup version of MTSS into a short period of time. And you are more than welcome or encouraged to attend any of our full day trainings that are coming up over the next few months and into next fall. But let's think about, okay, that's a lot, right? So what do we do now? Well, one of the things that I would suggest is that you start looking at your school, your building, your district, and think about, what do we have going on? And we know that we're always looking to improve outcomes for students. I mean, that's really the goal with everything that we do in education, is we want to bring students forward, bring them up. And so we start plugging in a lot of evidence-based practices or evidence-informed interventions, and we put stuff in, and that's great too, until your system starts to look like this. And I've been in schools that look like this, where there is so much going on that I don't even know all of what is going on. And if you follow some of these, you'll see that some of them are kind of on the road to nowhere. They don't necessarily get to the improved outcomes for all students. Sometimes they just blow up or disappear. And that can happen when you've got a really good program or something that is all centered around one staff member who is like the guru in that area, or, has been to all the trainings, but really doesn't build up the skill set of other people around them. And then that person leaves. Sometimes the program dies with them. So some of those things happen. Sometimes it's so complicated that as a classroom teacher, I'm like, I don't even know where to start. I just would rather ignore the problem because I'm not sure what thing is right to support the student. So when you take stock in what's going on, and you don't need to create that kind of thing, but if you do it through kind of this way, then you can start to thin out the things that aren't working and to look for the gaps of where do we need some additional support. One of the bodies of research and practice out there that can be really helpful is the field of implementation science. And implementation science is all around finding ways and factors and things that help maintain, or potentially the opposite, good practices happening. So this is not education specific. This could be in a business or in any sort of human services field. There are a lot of things out there that people have really good intentions, and we bring in new things, and then sometimes they don't happen the way we intended. And so in order to really create change, it's important that we have all of the different pieces across the top. We have to have a vision, meaning we have to know what we're doing. What does this look like? What's this all about? Which means we need to share that message. We need to have the skill set to be able to do it. So that's really around building that capacity within our staff to be able to do something. We need to have incentives, and I'm not talking about chocolate or extra pay, because those are really hard to come by. The incentive is, if I do this, I should expect these good things to happen, these outcomes. I should know why I'm doing the thing that I'm doing. Because asking me just to do something for the sake of it, or put in extra work, but not knowing what I'm going to get out of it or what the kids are going to get out of it, it's not real motivating. I need to have the resources to be able to do it, whether it's the time, the stuff, the materials, and then there needs to be an action plan, meaning there are a lot of working parts in bringing anything new into a system. And having a plan of who's going to be responsible for what parts is what makes it all happen. Now, you can see from the graphic that if you're missing any one of those pieces, you tend to get a result that is less than optimal. For example, if you don't know the vision, you don't know what something is supposed to look like or how it's all supposed to happen, there tends to be confusion in the system. If I don't have the skill set to do it, you're going to have some anxiety. If you ask me to play in an NBA basketball game, it's not going to happen. I'm probably going to have a complete panic attack because I wouldn't have the skill set to do it. So you can see that there's a piece to each of these that if something is missing, that you're going to have some weakness in the system. Now, imagine though that in some of your buildings, bringing in something new sometimes comes with multiple pieces that are missing. And so you tend to have multiple problems that are barriers to implementation of whatever it is that you're doing. So when you apply this then back to multi-tiered system of support, we need to have a good understanding of what that's going to look like in our district before rolling it out. We need to build up the skill set of our educators. We need to tell the why. Why are we doing this? What are we hoping to get out of this? And that's important not only for the staff, but for the students, for the parents, for the community. We need to make sure that we're setting it up in a situation where it's likely to be effective because we've got the resources to make it happen. And again, it doesn't have to be money. A lot of it centers around time and maybe restructuring how we do certain things. And then we've got to have a plan, and we've got to have some things written out so that it's very clear of who is responsible for what. So where can you start? I mean, you all are here. I don't know if a few of you, I think, might be here from similar districts, but thinking about what can I just do, or what can I help to bring into my district as far as just little starting points. Within that leadership domain, really developing that language and thinking about how can we start to build the foundation? So looking up websites, looking at resources, attending maybe some more webinars from a different perspective, doing book studies. Those things can be good starts before just saying, okay, tomorrow we're going to start this framework. Really dig into your data and look at, do we have the right data? And are we collecting stuff that we don't need to collect? Are we missing things that we need to add in? Finding time to increase that collaboration time, whether it's purposefully scheduled or whether you're using some of those existing collaborative times like PLCs, grade level meetings, content area meetings, any of those things that might already be built in, thinking about how can we truly use that time to share data and look at practices across those different groups. And then shifting your thinking to the whole child. Even for classrooms that no problems are even evident yet, looking at student strengths and interests, having kids fill out an interest card, having staff interact with students to get a better sense of what's going on. Look at their abilities. What do they have going on already? And then taking that inventory of your current resources. And that's not the only way to do it. There are a lot of inventories out there that can help you just kind of collect, who's had training in what kind of programs do we have? What do we have that we still have, but nobody's really using? What are some of the staff strengths out there? And sometimes, I mean, this may sound a little silly, but even knowing like who on my staff knows how to crochet, because if I have to connect with a student who's really struggling with mental wellness, but they want to learn a new skill, it may be connecting them with somebody who can use an activity to help support what's going on with the student, help foster communication. Who on my staff speaks another language? Sometimes we don't know that either. And we have students that we may struggle to really connect with. All right, I know we're down to just 2 minutes. So I want to share, again, there are a lot of resources that are available on the Padlet, and I would encourage you to check those out. And I said I would get on here and get this to come up again. I'm going to go back and just copy that. There you go. But there are some things that are on here that are not on the Padlet too. So a lot of different resources that you can find related to different topics, and they're in the broader scheme of multi-tiered system of support. some that are focused on particular areas within that. So these are all related to MTSS kind of as a whole. A couple of websites that are really helpful when you're looking at universal design for learning. And then the National Center on Intensive Intervention is just a gold mine of different interventions and programs and progress monitoring tools. And it has features where you can kind of sort that down to say, you know, this is a fifth grader and I'm concerned about reading and I want to know, you know, what kind of research is out there on these different programs, and you can do comparisons. Behavior, reading, some response to intervention, problem-solving information, a couple of other resources related to response to intervention, and implementation science at the NERN website. And then the University of Missouri, I really like their website for behavioral interventions. It helps you to kind of sort them in a different way than we normally would. So just check these things out on your own. And Karen, if you go to the Padlet, that is where you can find the handout that has, you can print the slides out. You are welcome. So one thing that I would ask you to do, and you will get a follow-up email with this, but if you can either scan or go to the evaluation link that's on the left, we do rely on feedback from everyone in order to keep our program running, in order to keep our contract going, but also to constantly make changes. I know these webinars are a little bit shorter and it's hard to get any kind of interaction, but any kind of feedback that you can give on whether this was useful or not, I would certainly appreciate that. And if you're interested in any other of our trainings, you can follow the link on the right, and that will take you to our training catalog that goes into the fall as of right now, and then we'll add on some additional things. There are other resources available. If there's something that you're interested in that is not on our catalog, we certainly offer other things that we come into district and present as well. So I appreciate everyone's time. You'll get a follow-up email, and you will also get a certificate for your professional growth points for tonight. So thank you very much.